The sound was deafening. Thousands of hooves crushed the earth, raising dust like a veil over the horizon. To the south, the Islamic crescent advanced, carrying with it the weight of an invincible empire. To the north, Christian villages prayed, believing the last dawn was near. And in the midst of this abyss, a man who was not a king, yet held in his hands the fate of a continent. You are on Faith and Power, where living history reveals secrets that never reach the altar. Subscribe now and comment. Where are you watching? From right now? Because today, you will discover how a single battle changed the future of Europe. The 8th century was, for many Christians in Europe, a time of suffocating fear. Since the fall of Rome, the old order that had sustained the continent had fragmented into fragile kingdoms, constantly threatened by invasions, famine, and internal disputes. But to the south, a new power was rising with overwhelming force, the Umayyad Caliphate. In just a few decades, Islamic armies had crossed deserts and seas, conquering vast regions of the Middle East, North Africa, and finally, the Iberian Peninsula. The takeover of Hispania had been swift, almost without significant resistance. Entire cities surrendered, and those that resisted were swept away like dust before the wind. For the monks and priests, copying the scriptures in isolated monasteries, every new report brought by merchants or travelers seemed to confirm a dark omen. The cross was giving way to the crescent. Churches were being turned into mosques, and ancient bells were silenced forever. Some Christians accepted the new authority in exchange for keeping their lives and property, paying tribute to the caliph. Others, more devout or stubborn, fled north, carrying only what they could and spreading stories of massacres that ignited both imagination and fear. The advance seemed unstoppable. In the year 732, Muslim forces led by Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Al-Andalus, crossed the Pyrenees. His aim was not merely plunder, though that was tempting, but the definitive expansion of Islamic rule in Europe. The heart of Gaul, the lands Rome had once called flourishing provinces, was within reach. If it fell, nothing would stop the tide from sweeping further north, perhaps even to the British Isles. Meanwhile, deep within Gaul, political divisions eroded any chance of unified resistance. The Frankish realms were a mosaic of territories, ruled by nobles with their own agendas, more concerned with internal rivalries than with the enemy advancing upon them. The Merovingian throne existed only as a symbol. Real power rested in the hands of those strong enough to rally warriors and resources in moments of crisis. The population lived under constant tension. Small villages prayed day and night, asking God to send a deliverer. For many, the memory of Rome was a distant myth, but the fear of a future ruled by a foreign faith was immediate and real. Reports from the south described seasoned soldiers, light and agile cavalry capable of covering great distances quickly. They brought not only war, but also a culture and religion vastly different from Europe's, with laws and customs that would forever change daily life. In cities like Tours and Poitiers, monks gathered to discuss biblical passages about ancient battles, seeking comfort in the stories of David against Goliath or Israel against enemy armies. Yet there were also those who wondered in silence if God had abandoned Europe. It was a dangerous doubt, but hard to ignore when reality seemed to be marching toward disaster. In this climate, the need arose for a figure capable of facing the enemy, someone who could unite the scattered forces of Frankish Christendom and offer more than prayers, offer a victory. This figure would not come from royalty, nor from a lineage destined for the throne. His name was Charles, and although he was not yet called Martel, his strike would soon echo like the blow of a hammer on the anvil of history. Before Charles fully stepped onto the stage, the danger grew with each passing day. Abdul Rahman advanced with confidence, aware that Europe was divided and weakened. His scouts were already probing the quickest routes to reach the centers of wealth and power. And while Frankish lords debated alliances and rivalries, the fate of Christendom was being decided step by step along the abandoned Roman roads. When the columns of Islamic soldiers approached Poitiers, few believed they could be stopped. Yet, in the hearts of some men, a stubborn flame refused to go out. They still believed that one last effort, one final battle, could change everything, and it would be that spirit, combined with the cunning of an unlikely leader, that would give birth to one of the most decisive moments in the history of Europe. Charles was born in the shadow of a throne that in practice no longer ruled. The illegitimate son of Pepin of Herstal, the true ruler of the Frankish kingdom, Charles grew up without the guarantees and privileges of an official heir. From an early age, he had to prove his worth not by right of blood, but by the strength of his arm and the sharpness of his mind. While Merovingian princes displayed golden crowns in hollow ceremonies, Charles trained among warriors hardened by the cold of campaigns and the hunger of long marches. When his father died, the kingdom plunged into chaos. Rival nobles tried to prevent Charles from holding any power, imprisoning him to remove him from the struggle. For months, he was locked, away in damp dungeons, listening to chains scraping against the stone walls. But his allies, faithful to the promise they had made to his father, freed him in a daring operation, and he returned to the political stage not as a prince, but as a commander determined to reclaim what had been denied to him. Charles did not rule from a throne but from the battlefield. His authority came not from decrees, but from the trust earned with every victory. Gathering men from various Frankish tribes, he forged a loyal army where discipline and faith outweighed birthright. His eyes could read the terrain, spotting an advantage where others saw only hills and rivers, and above all he held an unshakable conviction. The survival of Christendom depended on halting the Islamic advance that threatened to break into the heart of Europe. At the time, the Umayyad Caliphate was not seen as a distant force. Its victories were fresh in everyone's memory. The Muslims had defeated much larger armies, crossed deserts and seas, taken fortified cities, and imposed their law over vast territories. Now Abdul Rahman was marching north with veterans of relentless campaigns, warriors accustomed to victory. To face such an enemy, Charles knew he needed more than bravery. He needed strategy, patience, and the ability to unite divided factions under a single banner. Summoning the Frankish nobles was no easy task. Many hesitated, fearing to abandon their lands to confront a threat that, for some, still seemed distant. Others believed the enemy could be bribed or diverted to plunder other regions. Charles listened to each argument, but his voice cut through like steel against iron. If Poitiers fell, nothing would stop the march to Tours, and if Tours fell, the cross could disappear from Western Europe. He began assembling his forces, not in haste, but with method. He chose a strategic point for the stand, far enough to avoid ambushes, yet close enough to intercept the enemy's advance. And while Abdul Rahman relied on the speed and momentum of his cavalry, Charles prepared a human wall solid as stone. His army was made up of veterans and recruits, nobles and peasants, united by a common cause. Prayers echoed in the camps, and the clinking of weapons mixed with the deep chants of monks who accompanied the troops. The presence of these men of faith was not mere ornament. It served as a reminder that this war was not only for land or wealth, but for the soul of a continent. Charles remained calm. He observed the enemy's movements from a distance, sending scouts to map every pass, every forest, every bend in the terrain. He had no intention of meeting Abdul Rahman in open ground, where Islamic cavalry could crush his ranks. Instead, he prepared a silent trap, forcing the enemy to fight under conditions that favored Frankish infantry, shielded by firm spears and shields like a living wall. On the night before the final march, Charles gathered his commanders. By torchlight, he drew the battle lines into the dirt. He spoke little, but each word carried the weight of a sacred vow. He did not promise victory, but he swore that if they fell, they would fall standing, defenders of faith and homeland. The hardened faces around him showed they understood exactly what was at stake. Meanwhile, the shadow of the enemy army drew nearer, carrying with it the smell of dust, sweat, and iron. At dawn, the fate of the Franks, and of all Europe, would be decided not by kings or princes, but by a man who bore the most powerful title of all, that of a commander his soldiers trusted to their last breath. The cold cut like a blade. The first autumn mists rose over the fields west of Poitiers, forming a thick veil that hid the approaching troops. Charles Martel had been on the ground for days, studying every slope, every tree, every irregularity. That could serve as an advantage. His men were positioned on a discreet rise, shielded by a compact line of spears and shields. There was no rush to attack. He waited for the enemy to come to them, forcing them to climb the slope and lose their momentum. To the south, the columns of the Islamic army advanced with confidence. Abdul Rahman knew his own strength. Swift horsemen, deadly archers, and veterans, hardened by relentless campaigns. Green banners rippled in the wind, and the rhythmic pounding of hooves echoed like a war drum. His scouts had already observed the Frankish formation from afar. To him, it was nothing more than another poorly equipped force, easy prey for his heavy cavalry. But Abdul Rahman did not know that Charles had chosen the ground as a hunter chooses the site of an ambush. The space was narrow, flanked by woods. That limited lateral movement and prevented wide assaults. A fast advance would turn into a grueling effort. Moreover, the weather played into the Franks' hands. Recent rain had left the ground uneven and treacherous for horses weighed down with armor. Now the two armies could see each other, separated by only a few hundred meters. Between them, a silence heavy with tension, broken only by the flutter of banners and the impatient neighing of horses. Charles walked along the front line, looking into the eyes of his men. He did not shout slogans. He spoke in a firm, low voice, reminding them that behind them stood their families, their churches, their fields. Defeat would not mean merely the loss of land. It would mean the submission of their faith and the slow death of everything they knew. Abdul Rahman, on the other side, organized his forces into impact columns. He relied on the first shock to break the Frankish ranks. His officers gave quick instructions, pointing out the gaps they thought they saw in the enemy's defense. To them, it was only a matter of time before the wall of shields gave way. Poitiers. Monks who accompanied Charles intoned deep chants, the sound spreading over the hill like an invisible mantle. The chorus did not ask for victory for a man, but for the faith itself. It was a strange sound to Muslim ears, accustomed to the call of the muezzin, yet equally charged with devotion. Each side carried the certainty that they fought under divine blessing, and that conviction made the clash inevitable. The day was consumed by cautious maneuvers. Charles refused to leave his elevated position, frustrating Abdul Rahman's desire to force a quick battle. Small skirmishes of reconnaissance flared at the edges of the field, but neither side risked the decisive strike. The nights were freezing, and the men slept with weapons within reach, knowing that a hasty move could decide everything too soon. On the second day, the tension reached an almost unbearable point. Abdul Rahman gathered his council and pressed for a frontal assault. Charles, alert to the signs, reinforced his flanks and positioned archers at strategic points. He knew that if he could withstand the first blow, he might have a chance to shatter the enemy's morale. By evening, the wind carried the smell of smoke from the enemy's campfires. Whispers spread through the Frankish lines. Tomorrow would be the day. The men sharpened blades, reinforced shields, and tightened straps. Charles once again walked among them, his gaze more eloquent than any speech. Those who met his eyes felt that he carried not only a plan, but the weight of centuries. On the last night before battle, the moon hid behind heavy clouds. The field lay shrouded in darkness and silence, as if the world itself were holding its breath for the moment when the two armies would clash. Every soldier knew that at dawn, history would be written not by scribes in gilded halls, but in the blood spilled on the cold earth. When the first light broke on the horizon, the mist seemed thicker than ever. Hearts beat in rhythm with the war drums. The final encounter was about to begin. The sun rose pale, filtered through the mist clinging to the field. The damp ground glistened under the faint light, as if the earth itself knew it would drink blood before the day was over. The silence broke when the deep sound of Islamic war. Drums began to echo, marking the pace of the cavalry aligning to the south. Spears caught scattered rays of light, forming a forest of deadly points. Charles Martel stood motionless in the front line. His gaze swept across the field with a hunter's precision. There was no room for hesitation. Around him, the Franks held a tight formation, shields overlapping, spears jutting forward like iron teeth. Behind them, monks held crosses, murmuring, prayers that blended with the distant rhythm of hooves. The first move came from Abdul Rahman, a hand signal, and his cavalry surged forward, building speed. The pounding of hooves sounded like unending thunder, accompanied by war cries that cut through the air. The impact was imminent, and many Franks pressed their shields tighter to their chests, feeling the weight of the moment. When the clash came, the world turned into a whirlwind of iron and flesh. Spears shattered, shields splintered, and the first. Men fell without even seeing who had struck them. But the Frankish formation held. The horses, slowed by the uneven ground and the uphill climb, failed to break through the human wall. Charles's warriors struck with precision, aiming for the horses' legs, toppling riders to be finished on the ground. Abdul Rahman ordered another charge, this time attempting to flank the Frankish lines, but the narrow woods blocked the maneuver. Every attempt to circle around was met with a rain of arrows and thrown spears, sapping their momentum. The battle was becoming a contest of endurance, where Charles's patience mattered as much as his men's courage. The sound was deafening. Shouts of command, the clash of steel, the desperate whinnies of horses. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and churned earth. Charles moved along the lines, reinforcing weak points, urging exhausted soldiers to hold fast. His presence was like an anchor, keeping the army steady amid the storm of steel. Hours passed, and the field was strewn with bodies. The Islamic cavalry, frustrated, pulled back to regroup. It was then that Charles saw an opening. Without breaking formation, he pressed forward slowly, forcing the enemy to fight on unfavorable ground. The Franks advanced like a controlled tide, each step won with blood. By mid-afternoon, an unexpected move shifted the battle's course. A group of Franks struck directly at the enemy's center, where Abdul Rahman commanded. The fighting was fierce, and later accounts claimed the governor fell surrounded by his best guards. His death spread uncertainty and panic through the Islamic ranks. Without their leader, cohesion collapsed. Many riders began to retreat, fearing encirclement. Charles ordered his men to keep up the pressure, but not to lose discipline. He knew that a reckless pursuit could turn into a trap. The priority was to ensure the enemy could not regroup. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the field fell silent. Only the groans of the wounded and the distant sounds of retreating troops remained. Victory was theirs, but the cost was high. The Franks had lost many men, and every body on the ground was a reminder that this battle had been fought not just for territory, but for the survival of an entire civilization. Charles stood watching the field. There were no cries of celebration, only the quiet relief of those who had survived the impossible. The monks began their chants again, this time in thanksgiving. The sound drifted across the twilight, carrying the certainty that, for that day, the cross had endured. That night, in the flickering light of campfires, the men spoke in hushed voices, as if afraid to awaken the spirit of battle. Charles offered no promise of lasting rest. He knew other conflicts would come, but for that moment, Europe was safe. The night after Poitiers settled heavily over the field. The cold air carried the acrid scent of blood and smoke, mingled with the damp aroma of churned earth. The campfires cast distorted shadows over faces marked by exhaustion and loss. Few words were spoken. The victory had been won, but every man knew the price he had paid to remain alive. The monks moved among the wounded, holding lanterns and whispering quiet prayers. They touched fevered foreheads, murmuring blessings over those still breathing. Around them, the silence was broken only by groans and by the distant sound of hammers, improvising repairs on shattered shields and broken spears. Even in rest, the habits of war clung to the soldiers. Charles Martel walked the field slowly. He passed by bodies laid side by side, some covered with cloaks, others left exposed, as if simply seeing them was a reminder of what had been at stake. There was no room for boisterous celebration. The victory had not been a glorious triumph, but a bitter rescue from the edge of the abyss. At dawn, the mist returned, shrouding the landscape. It seemed to hide the traces of battle, as if the earth itself sought to swallow the memory of the blood spilled. The Islamic army was in retreat. Without Abdul Rahman, his men chose to preserve their strength and avoid further losses. Charles, cautious, gave no order to pursue. He knew the victory was sealed by the enemy's withdrawal, and advancing could lead his men into an ambush on unfamiliar ground. In Tours, the news arrived with the force of a miracle. Bells rang for hours, calling the people to give thanks to God. In churches, priests recounted the battle as a sign of divine protection, describing Charles as the chosen instrument to preserve the faith. Yet, while the population rejoiced, the commander himself kept a grave expression. He understood that Poitiers had not been the end of the threat, only a pause. The caliphate still controlled vast territories to the south, and the pressure would not vanish overnight. Even so, the immediate effect was profound. The Frankish nobles, once hesitant to unite under a single command, now saw in Charles not merely a military leader, but a savior. His authority solidified, and the loyalty earned on the battlefield was transforming into political power. It was the beginning of a new order, where the ability to protect borders and preserve the faith mattered more than ancient bloodlines. The survivors returned to their villages with stories etched into their skin and memory. They spoke of the deafening thunder of hooves, the crushing weight of the impact, the stubborn resilience of the shields. For many, Charles Martel had become an almost mythical figure, not a king, but a protector, a hammer who had broken the enemy's advance. Yet for Charles himself, glory was only a curtain over reality. He knew the enemies would test Christendom's defenses again. The victory at Poitiers had bought time, but that time had to be used to strengthen the realm, train new soldiers, and secure alliances. He harbored no illusions. The silence that follows a battle is rarely peace. More often, it is the held breath before the next storm. That autumn, the lands to the north breathed easier. Villages rebuilt their defenses, monasteries resumed their copying of the scriptures, and trade slowly returned to the roads. But the echo of the battle remained. Every warrior who had been at Poitiers carried in his eyes the memory of the day. Europe almost fell. Charles kept his troops on alert. He continued to train, to gather intelligence, to negotiate with regional leaders. For him, the battle had not been only about defending a border, but about preserving an identity. The cross his men had defended was not only a symbol of faith, but of continuity, of a story that would not be erased by the advance of a foreign empire. When he finally returned to his residence, he brought no treasures or spoils. He carried only the certainty that, for now, the wall of Christendom still stood. But in the silence of his nights, he knew the hammer would have to be raised again. If Abdul Rahman had won at Poitiers, the map of Europe would have been drawn in different colors. The road to Tours would have been open, and with it, the path to the heart of Gaul. Without significant resistance, the Islamic cavalry could have reached the Atlantic ports and the routes to the north, establishing a direct bridge between the Iberian Peninsula and new conquests. The cathedrals slowly rising would have been halted, turned into mosques, or left in ruins. Church bells would have fallen silent, replaced by the call of the muezzin echoing over cities and fields. Latin, the language of liturgy and administration, would have given way to Arabic, bringing new laws, new currencies, and new ways of life. 3. Frankish kingdoms, fragmented and vulnerable, would have struggled to reorganize after such a blow. Many nobles would have sworn loyalty to the new power, accepting the caliphate's rule in exchange for protection and privileges. Others would have resisted in isolated fortresses, becoming warlords on the fringes of an increasingly foreign order. The Christian faith, though not vanishing overnight, would have been pushed to the margins. Monasteries might have survived in remote regions, acting as clandestine guardians of a forgotten past. Pilgrimages to Rome would have become dangerous or impossible, and the Pope would have lost direct influence over vast areas we now consider the cradle of Western Christendom. European culture, shaped by the synthesis of Roman heritage, barbarian. Traditions and Christian faith would have taken another course. Philosophy, art, and architecture would have been deeply influenced by the styles and knowledge of the Islamic world, rich and complex, but far from the forms we now associate with medieval Europe. The Carolingian Renaissance, which centuries later revitalized learning and the arts, might never have occurred. More profoundly, the very idea of a Christian Europe might have lost all meaning. The spiritual frontier that solidified after Poitiers would never have existed. In its place, a vast multicultural territory under Muslim rule might have stretched from the Mediterranean to northern France. The Reconquista, which in reality took centuries in the Iberian Peninsula, might have extended across the entire continent, or perhaps never begun at all. Charles Martel would not have entered history as the Hammer, and his lineage might have faded into the shadow of new rulers. Without his legacy, the rise of Charlemagne and the formation of the Holy Roman Empire could have been impossible. The balance between religious and military power that shaped European politics for centuries would have followed a completely different course. The Crusades, if they happened at all, would have begun from a much weaker position, or might have been no more than small regional uprisings. Jerusalem, instead of being a distant goal for European knights, might have been part of the same political order ruling much of France and Germany. In the spiritual realm, the pressure on Christian communities might have produced a different kind of Christianity, quieter, adapted to survive under laws that restricted it. Biblical texts might have been preserved in secret, passed from generation to generation as forbidden relics. Gregorian chants might have been replaced with adapted hymns or disappeared altogether. This scenario is not mere imagination. It measures the significance of Poitiers. A Muslim victory would not only have altered borders, it would have reshaped the heart and mind of an entire continent. The battle's outcome did more than defend a territory. It preserved the continuity of a tradition that, with all its flaws and contradictions, shaped the world we live in today. And yet, the Frankish victory did not mean the struggle was over. The clash of civilizations expressed on that battlefield would continue for centuries, sometimes in arms, other times in ideas and trade. Poitiers was a line in the sand, thin, contested, but decisive. Looking at the present, one cannot help but wonder how many invisible battles, political or cultural, still define what we call our heritage. History rarely offers second chances. In 732, it gave Europe a moment to breathe. What was done with that breath-shaped centuries of art, politics, and faith? If Poitiers had ended differently, perhaps the sound that woke the cities at dawn would not have been the ringing of bells, but a chant rising from towers facing Mecca. And perhaps, in telling this story, we would not speak of Charles Martel as a savior, but as a forgotten name, lost beneath the sands of time. Poitiers was not just a battle. It was the moment when Europe stood on the edge of the abyss, and a handful of men chose not to retreat. Charles Martel sought neither crowns nor titles. He sought to protect something that could not be bought: the faith, the memory, and the future of his people. Centuries later, we still walk beneath the shadow of that choice. With every bell that rings, with every church that rises, there echoes almost invisibly the strike of that hammer against the tide that threatened to consume everything. And now, in the face of this history, I ask, how many times in our own age have faith and identity stood one step away from vanishing? And how many times has someone risen to stop it? If this battle has moved you, subscribe to the Faith and Power channel. And comment, where are you watching us from? Because history continues, and you are part of it.